Hello. Well, the game is loading and we get started here. This was originally designed as a question and answer for the last video on the relationship between ontology and epistemology, what we know and how do we know it. However, I didn't have many questions on that, and so I thought that rather than expand on that topic, I would present a book review on the Proteus Paradox by Nick Yee. The Proteus Paradox it's a research book. It was published in 1979 about online gaming communities. And so I think that it has, despite of its age, which in computer terms is ancient, the psychological conditions that were actually talked about in it are actually relevant to things that are going on today. And it's a fascinating read that people might be interested in. Also, as we get into that, I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about relevant aspects of the game that connects to the sort of material that Nick Yee is talking about. For people watching who are not really familiar with this game, this is Oxygen Not Included. It's put out by Clay Entertainment. It's essentially a management simulation game. We have two indicators that we have to worry about in this particular session. The first one is our oxygen, which is beginning to look pretty sad. I have oxygen plants. We're building the farm down here. And I also am going to be spending time on the plumbing panel, which we have no plumbing right now except a few things here, and we've got to get that plumbing together. So that is what we are want to get done here to set up a vertical farm. So while I'm talking about this is primarily what we're going to do, is set up the vertical farm, and I'm going to give an overview of the book by Nick Yee. So let me first, so I don't get totally lost here, let me turn this on. That way we can get these people, hopefully, getting some work done. Hard to say. They seem to still be stuck, however, in pause. I wonder why. No, because it's on. Okay, I got that figured out. I didn't know that you could do the pause and the fast forward at the same time. Okay, well, with any luck, as they start building out this here, the Proteus Paradox was published by Yale University Press in 1979, and Nick Yee was a video game researcher at the time. The book opens with a talking about avatars and how avatars will actually change people's perception of themselves online. So somebody who has an avatar that is taller is more likely to act more confident in the game space situation. That virtual reality allows us to manipulate other people's perceptions of ourselves. And there's both something liberating and exciting about that, but there's also something a little darker about that, because why do we need to manipulate other people's opinions to have better opinions for ourselves? And the paradox that's actually talked about in the book is these psychological levers. One of the things that's very interesting to me about the book is that the psychological terms that that are used in it are very similar psychological terms that are used in winning arguments with. Can we get these people to do this? Thank you. In something such as Changing Minds by Gardner. And so there is something there that is definitely of use. Now, one of the interesting aspects, although just give me a moment here because apparently I can't run a pipe and talk at the same time. So my multitasking, not so great. Let's try this again. I'm going to go through these, come up to here, go through these, go up here, go through these, come up to here, and come over. Well, I was going to go over. But actually I'm going to have to put a bridge here, and then I'm going to do this funny little thing here because I don't want this to be submerged or it'll back up my farms. So, and that means they have to be able to get across there. So I'll have to put that in. Do we have a narcoleptic here? No narcoleptics? Then we're just going to take some dirt. Okay. While they work on this, which will take forever because I've given them too big of a task probably. And I also want them to clean the toilet. Okay. One of the arguments against games, even games like this, is that games are seen as escapist, and that is somehow bad. And I would say that anything without moderation is bad. But with moderation, having some escapism, having something that is a learning activity is not really an issue. But the arguments against video games are frequently based on, well, the reason the person is playing video games is because they want to escape whatever it is and they can't deal with their life. There's actually a growing body of scientific evidence that is basically not true. That's based on several assumptions. We've talked about in the previous videos assumptions quite a bit. I won't really get into it right now, but whenever we make this assumption that video games are bad because somebody is making they're promoting violence, or they're promoting escapism, or they can't handle their lives, or whatever it is that the people are playing the game for, we have to ask where this information is coming from and what is the purpose of it being sent out. Is it a neutral study, or is it something that is decidedly not a neutral study and is being done for a purpose, whether it's political or otherwise? Maybe I don't want to do that. I think I'll put my air system in. So, and that Yee addresses that right up in the beginning to more or less, I think, get it out of the way. The book is written in a scientific research style. It maintains a friendly conversation, and it doesn't have a lot of $10 words. It's pretty plain English. It's very clear, but it is also very much a research book. Yee discussed how the first, when you look at your online games and your video games, that they really started, and the first applicable game, there had been war games from before. You could look at chess, and it goes back centuries, but the first tabletop game was actually in 1812. It was Kriegspiel. It was developed by the Prussian military, and it had rules: how far a tank can move, how far people can move. Those rules were simplified in 1913, by H.G. Wells, the writer, and resold under simpler rules and a little easier to understand as Little Wars. And tabletop wargaming still retains those conventions. Personally, I play 40K, and we have rules on how far a tank can move, what turn order we're in, what armies have what strengths. And I think one of the difficulties with people who are new to the tabletop scene is that the war games are fairly complicated. I mean, Warhammer 40K is a 300-page something rule book. And so it's a little off-putting to people. Coming up from the tabletop, he talks briefly about the change from first chainmail and then later into Dungeons and Dragons, so that more role-playing games. Now, it's kind of important to note, because I think a lot of people do not really understand this if they're not in that gaming circle world. Role-playing games, the pen and paper ones, I'll talk about those first. The pen and paper role-playing games, they're not called role-playing games because you're actually role-playing a character. That's I think, frequently misunderstood. I think it's even frequently misunderstood by people who are in the genre. That in actual fact, role-playing games is based on whether you're moving from a tactical battle where you're manipulating squads and battalions, such as in something like 40K, moving to something like Dungeons and Dragons where you have a single user or a small party based and you have fewer people. The role-playing aspect itself, I like paper and pen games. I don't actually play Dungeons and Dragons, but I do like Call of Cthulhu and the Cypher system. I've played those with people who do not role-play them. Role-playing, I find only some people will role-play. Others will be, my character says they're going to go there. My character is going to do this. That's not role-playing. Role-playing is, I am now going to take on the persona of the person. I am going to do this. And that's more of a smaller selection, a niche in the community. So, for what it's worth, for people that are looking outside and saying, you know, I don't understand this role-playing aspect where they're going to pretend to be somebody else, only a small group of people do that, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's no different than getting together with some friends and putting on a theater play, which people used to do before you had television and radio. So that's it's not really unusual. It's not new. It's not totally different. It's just it has a different trapping on it. Personally, I would really like to see at some point some research done on the evolution of role-playing games and how it connects to the older games of something like charades. Charades is, when you look at the face of it, not that different than your basic role-playing games. So where you're taking on another persona, you're pretending to be somebody there. Everybody in the charades games knows that you're not really taking on that persona. And the same is in a role-playing game circle. I think that sometimes it's misunderstood by people who are outside of the genre. We're going to get some heat tiles. Now, I need to keep people focused on this work because otherwise they're going to run out of oxygen and this is going to be a short colony. So, I'm going to prioritize all of this, and they simply have to get this work done. It's worth noting that Yee does not talk about charades versus video games. But he does bring up the idea of moving from, that there's a clear evolution between the tabletop games, which started in military, moved over to a more tactical fun, going to the paper and pen role-playing games, and then moving to computer games and eventually into online communities. So there is a definite connections between your your online community gaming and the going back to the tactical gaming, and there's different types of players. Yee mentioned that there was quantitative information originally gathered by Richard Bartle, that gamers fell into categories. They came into achievers. They're playing a game because they want to achieve something. Some people might be motivated in this game, for instance. I have 2 duplicants that died. Well, that is sad. How? Well, we'll find them eventually, but that means I gotta get some burials here. They might have died because of our oxygen issues. Well, work further. This is going to be a short colony, but some people might be interested because they're looking for these things, which is your achievements, and they want to make, when they see an achievement like this pop up or a badge in another game, they think, yes, this is what I am playing for. I want to get that thrill of an achievement. I feel kind of sorry for her because she's the only one left now. Now, this is what happens when I'm babbling on and not paying attention to my poor duplicants. She seems to be relatively happy, though. A little stressed out, possibly because she knows she's in a death trap. But look how much room she has now. It's not all negative. Some people play games to do social actions. And this is particularly true in online communities where they can form guilds or clubs depending upon what the game is. And they can work together or potentially against each other. And so that is also a potential option. Some people play, and Richard Bartle described them as being killers, that they exist solely to cause misery for the other people around them. We may even know people like this, that are that what they're playing for is not necessarily the same as the other group. I like cooperative games, and sometimes I meet players who are not interested in the cooperative game. They just want to make the scenario harder for everyone else, particularly if they have experience in the cooperative game. They grow almost bored with it Why help other people out? They instead want to somehow get involved in a situation where they can make life more entertaining for them by making it harder for the rest of the group. This doesn't really bother me that much. If taken to its extremes, I'll start to have some issues. Because if there's a kid or a child or someone who really wants to play the game and it's their first time, that can really kind of wreck the experience. But if it doesn't, wreck the experience, it can be we can work with that. I've played Zombicide before with people who really try to make the game more complicated, but I've played it enough that I'm okay with that challenge. And if I'm not okay with that challenge, well then the next time I just don't invite those people back. So that's another archetype of the video gamer. There's also people who explore, that they're just interested in seeing what the world is like. Maybe they play, and that's not just online games, that's any type of game, that they're really interested in just exploring and seeing what's around. A game like Subnautica might be one that you find very interesting from the purpose of being able to explore. In this particular case, I'm exploring the idea of a vertical farm, which is not going so well because of I only have one person left. On the other hand, it makes it more important. One person cannot do this whole job. So if we can get this job done, then it will kind of take care of itself and she'll be able to eat and have food and oxygen. So it might work out well yet. Yee expands this with people who are immersion, that they play a game for the purpose of immersion. And that's your role players who actually want to play through the game for it. So there are multiple player types. He describes 5 of them in this. He also mentions this idea of power gaming, or if you're coming from a tabletop or strategy game or a no narcoleptics, and that's not a good thing because I need some more people, but we'll just take whatever those things are. Sometimes power gamers, they're just looking to be not just create the best character that they can, but they want to create a character that is more powerful than everyone else around them. Puffin Forrest, in his D&D series that he has online, I'll put a link to it in the description, actually addresses this issue because they can be sometimes very frustrating to play with. Because whatever it is that motivates them to play a game, and I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying it's not necessarily what everybody else in the group has. What's motivating that person to play the game is to be better than everyone else. If you're in a competitive game such as the aforementioned 40K, that's not so bad. I've played against people, you're in a competitive game. So as long as you're basically following the rules, you create the list ahead of time, you say what the point values are, you're okay. I tend to play, personally, Imperial Guard in that, has a lot of infantry, some tanks, and I usually put some artillery in the back. I remember when I went in and played against another person, and they, at the gaming club, decided that they would change their list so that they would be able to face me. And at that one time, I remember I took Tank Battalion because I own a lot of Imperial Guard tanks, and they brought all las cannons so that they could just gun me down in the first turn. I don't play with that person anymore. I've been asked to. He liked that game. But I'm like, it wasn't really fun for me, and it's cheating, so I'm not, going to play with you. I'm not going to make a big deal at that time. I'm just not going to play again with you because it's not worth my time. And so sometimes people they min-max, and min-maxing refers to they're taking one role to the high extreme. So they're going to be the fighter for the party and have the best fighting stats that are available, but they don't necessarily have stats that they consider to be useless. Those are the minimum. That exists in online communities. It exists in pretty much all video games to a certain extent that are within a genre of you're creating a character. Specifically with levels and how you can choose to build out the characters. And then mods that you can put into a game to modify your games can do that even more. And for the most part, it can be fun. You can work with those people. Certainly not all power gamers are not going to play with, but there does seem to be a subset of power gamers that I'm instinctively wary of, just because they're so focused on the rules that they become slightly crazy with them. For me, it's very difficult to get upset about losing or winning a game of 40K because I cannot stop the fact that I am a middle-aged, moving into old age, and I'm still playing with plastic tanks and army soldiers. So it's very hard for me to take this as a serious sort of thing, not certainly as serious as a job or friendships or family or anything like that. But I've played against people that have, and I'm not talking kids here, in their 60s, who have essentially temper tantrums because they're not winning a game. And I've run across that not just in 40K, but in Zombicide and other things. This is something that Yee actually mentions in the context of operant conditioning, which is a psychological term where there's rewards that person wants. They need those rewards. That operant conditioning was actually devised as a way to get people to do tasks that they may not want to do. The military does it. An example. We have to do this thing. We'll give you a reward to be able to be successful so that you will do this task. And corporations do it. Businesses do it. Schools do it. To a certain extent, the A that you get in school that says you did a great job is a part of that operant conditioning. Because the A doesn't necessarily mean that you understand it better than others. It means that you can replicate it in a testing environment, which is why, and I'm moving a little aside from Yee's book, but why I actually advocate practicals in tests. Some people, let's say nursing students, might be terrific at knowing all the terminology and knowing the correct answers to do. And yet, when I taught a nursing class that involved medical law, HIPAA largely, and different facets of negligence, some of the nurses did not do in that class as well as I would have expected when it was a practical that they had to role play through somebody who was already coached on how to behave. Either another teacher, or in this case we just had some stand-in students that had a role to play. And one of them failed HIPAA. They would have lost their job had that been a real situation. And I remember that student was really upset because it wasn't real. But it was a practical exercise, and they had A's up to that point where they're doing, they're able to reiterate information back. But that A didn't mean that they actually understood the material better than other people in class. So that A is a version of operant conditioning. Maybe the people fell asleep. See, here's one. He fell asleep because I have narcoleptics in the low oxygen area rather than work. He could have climbed the ladder. This is what happens when you're lazy. Probably the other one's dead down here too. It's kind of annoying. Now this poor person here has to do, Catalina has to do the entire job herself. Anyway, back to Yee's book. Operant conditioning, for those of you that wish to check out and learn more about it, it was really codified. It existed before Skinner, but it was really codified by Skinner famously on some dog and pigeon experiments, which by today's standards are questionable in the ethics of how the animals, well, and people were treated. But that idea of, if you do this, then you will get this reward. And if you do not get this, then you will get this punishment, knowing that most people want to seek a pleasurable reward. They want to receive an award that makes them feel good. And perhaps if there's enough interest, I'll talk about this later in another video, because it is quite common in Western society, specifically in the United States. Schooling, in public schools, you'll see this quite a bit. One thing that was kind of interesting is that you referenced a book called Got Game. It might be a study by John Beck and Mitchell Wade, and it talks about how it's the concept of free labor, how a video game essentially teaches a version of free labor. For instance, if you're working in I'm going to have to give her build. If you're working in a game and you become the guild leader, it's a lot of work that you're doing. You're not being paid, and you might still enjoy it. And corporations have learned from this. Corporations, at least some, to a part, have taken notice of video games, because many of your online video games, specifically, they blur work and fun from management, discipline, and then issues with managing people so that they're not overworking themselves or they get stressed out. In this game, I'm talking about these issues, and I have, oh yeah, see, the other guy did. He fell asleep. My two guys fell asleep in the low oxygen and then died. I probably worked them to death. Well, they shouldn't have gone to sleep there. We have good beds up here. And poor Catalina is busy trying to now build out the entire farms. But we have a stress indicator up here, and I have to balance out their stress. In this case, I guess it's a little bit easier because there's these people that didn't make it. Yee actually has some reservations that he expressed in the book about using games in a corporate environment, not because they're not effective, not because they won't make it may be more fun to do training, but because corporations are not always aligned with the public good of the person that is actually playing the game. And it's notable that Yee does not state this is something that should not be done. It's more, this is something that should be looked at and should be considered a little bit more than just games are great everywhere. And the example that you used was in Facebook. That Facebook is more that people are susceptible. They freely share a lot of information online, which then Facebook uses to sell that information that was given to them freely to advertisers to target people. And many times people will complain about, I don't want the company to have all the information, and yet they post it out there. So Facebook's business model primarily is to have freely shared information collected, codified, and then used by corporations to target. So there's that level, and that level is basically a version of free labor. For me, the most interesting thing about the Proteus Paradox when I was reading it was really about how we see ourselves as avatars. And I am definitely going to find some more research on that topic, because it brings up both a question on self, our perceptions of self, and I want to know if it's linked to self-confidence issues. I don't know that answer. I can make a presumption that perhaps that is the issue, that if I was short, that perhaps I want to see myself as being tall. But I'm not really certain of what would motivate that, or how accurate and how, I guess, intimately involved we are with the avatar that we're playing. I've played online communities with Final Fantasy XIV, and I typically play a cat person. Now, I do have an obsession with cats. I do happen to like them, but I don't necessarily see myself as wanting to be a cat person. So I don't know if that's how relevant that is, because we don't use ourselves as research topics, right? So that's not really admissible in research. So I'm not really sure how that is. I'm really going to have to think about it a little bit more and look at this idea of using avatar as self. And that's pretty much the book from it. You don't see a narcoleptic here. No. Well, we could always use more oxygen. But I feel bad that she has to create the whole thing herself. I'm going to let this run just a little bit and see if I can manage to get her to finish this, because if this farm does not work out, we're going to be playing a different game. Because everybody will have died. So I need to get them to get that finished. Maybe having everybody just fall onto the ground and sleep is not a terrific idea. And it also means that in the next game, one thing we have to set up is we have to set up some graves to bury these people in, which is kind of sad. I've gone through whole games where they haven't died. Although, to be fair, I've not played games where then I talk about totally unrelated topics. I play games where I talk, but they're usually to other people on related topics to the game that I'm playing. This is actually quite a bit harder than I thought it would be. It does not bode well for the other games that I was looking at. You know, if this water goes through these pipes here, we can actually expand our farming out. We'll give her some extra work, because that's obviously what she needs. Someone asked me in the last, and they watched my video and they asked why I thought the research was so important. And I've already addressed this before, and they had watched the video, but the real answer was because it's not done very well. I think a lot of people are confused on the role of research and what it's getting done. And so I said I don't think it's done very well. I think many students, particularly in the college environment, they come in at the methodology level. They don't really understand what's going on in the ontology. And in the conversation with one of my peers, I realized that potentially this person also didn't necessarily understand ontology and the role it has in assumptions. And we ended up talking about it a little bit. So I think that this is a valid source. I think that she's going to do this and that she's going to get this thing done. So I'm going to end the video. I'm going to have her finish the farm and get it working. And then we'll pick up next week and we'll try to get some of the other things done, and we have to bring in a couple more people for it. But see, it's looking kind of ugly down here in unbreathable air. So we really have to get that fixed, which means getting the water done. And then we can start setting up some power grids. Right now we only have this one. And I'm a little worried about our food too. But we got the stress down to 0, so she doesn't seem to be too bothered, considering that she's walking on their corpses, about these 2 people who have died. Maybe they didn't contribute very much. So I will hopefully see you guys next week, and you'll get a chance to see me and my research cat. Take care.